Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's installment of our series, Dismantling Social Injustice, on the topics of economic mobility and urban policy. Before we dive in, let's review the event guidelines. This event will be recorded, though you will not appear in the video. Your audio will also be muted for the duration of the event. Our chat feature has been disabled for the event, but if you have a question, you can submit those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of this screen. We're going to start off with an introduction today to introduce our panelists, and then we'll dive right into our conversation with John Rice and Ester Fuchs. And to end off, we'll have a question and answer session with the questions that y'all provided in the Q&A feature. At Meetup, we believe in the importance of equity and racial justice, both internally and externally. It's important for us now and always to stand with the Black community. After the success of last month's Meetup Live event, How to Help Dismantle Social Injustice, we've decided to continue fostering these important conversations through our new series, Dismantling Social Injustice. Thank you again for joining us for its second installment. Last month, we discussed voting rights, justice, and public health. Today, we will focus on economic mobility and urban policy. Next, I'd like to introduce our two distinguished guests for the evening. John Rice is founder and CEO of Management Leadership for Tomorrow, or MLT, a national nonprofit that's transforming the leadership pipelines of our most influential organizations. MLT provides Black, Latinx, and Native American individuals with the coaching, playbook, and networks they need to excel in high trajectory careers, secure economic mobility for their families, and become high impact senior leaders who can advocate for vulnerable communities. MLT also advises institutions on how to create winning diversity and inclusion strategies. John founded MLT in 2002 after a successful career at Disney and the NBA. He left the private sector to found the organization he first envisioned as a Harvard MBA student in the 90s. At Harvard, John began delving into the reasons why there were few other students there who looked like him. He developed a thesis for a nonprofit that would provide the training, coaching, and networks that traditionally have been unavailable to minorities. Today, MLT has served more than 8,000 rising leaders and influenced recruitment, retention, and diversity strategy at more than 150 leading companies. John was appointed to President Obama's advisory commissions on educational excellence for African Americans and on historically Black colleges. He serves on the board of a number of nonprofits, including venture philanthropy fund New Profit. Ester Fuchs is Director of the Urban and Social Policy Program at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and Professor of International and Public Affairs and Political Science. Ester is also a member of the Faculty Steering Committee of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights and the Provost Just Societies Task Force. Ester served as Special Advisor to the Mayor for Governance and Strategic Planning under New York City Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg from 2001 to 2005. While at City Hall, she coordinated the restructuring of the city's out-of-school time programs, streamlined access to social services across 13 agencies by developing an online application through the Integrated Human Services Project, and merged the Department of Employment with the Department of Small Business Services to align the city's workforce development programs with the growing sectors of the economy. She was the first woman to serve as chair of the NYSE Charter Revision Commission in 2005, and currently serves on the boards of Fund for the City of New York, Citizens Union, and the Museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you both so much for being here this evening. Let's dive into tonight's subject matter. Our first topic is on our current state of economic mobility and urban policy. And this first question will be for Ester. What do you see happening within urban policy, be it education, criminal justice, housing, health, poverty, that's adding to the suppression of underrepresented minorities?
So this is a big question, and it's appropriate, of course. From my perspective, it's really important for us to connect structural racism to public policy. And that's probably something many people don't actually think about. The reason it's important is because it means it's not an accident. It means that we can actually do something about it by changing public policy. Because most Black and Hispanics still live in cities, even though there has been a trend towards suburbanization. It's really easy to focus on cities because that's the best place to see how policies actually affect people in their life and actually affect their life chances. And so just to give you a little flavor without trying to depress anybody too much, there are a number of areas in which the data actually show disparities very clearly between the African American community and white communities. And if you just start with education, for example, which is a local function through the school boards, you see it pretty clearly. You see it in graduation rates. You see it in the disparities in scores on standardized tests. Just as an example, in New York City alone, which has over a 25% Black population, 53% of New York students who graduate high school go on to attend college who are Black, while you have 68% of white youth who attend high school in New York who go on to attend college. This kind of education statistic is critical, I'm sure, as John will tell you, because the connection between education and all life chances are really, really important. And this doesn't happen, as I said, accidentally. There is a disparity in funding across education systems which have more minority students in them get less money. And just without belaboring the education point too much, you can see this play out virtually in every policy area. And the thing about cities and education, which are so important, is that people don't realize that education is primarily funded through a property tax. Property tax is local, so that areas which have large numbers of African Americans and large numbers of poor people have less money in their school systems. And while we certainly know that funding isn't everything when it comes to the quality of a service, it certainly accounts for a significant amount of what you can and cannot do. And so, I won't take more of my time now, I'll come back to it, but you see this disparity, whether it's home ownership, whether it's arrest rates. Stop and frisk was a big issue across the country, and you see disproportionate arrest rates for minority men, and who turn out, by the way, to have been innocent of anything at all. So we have the data not only to show disparities in arrest rates, but the fact that they hadn't even done anything by and large. And you see this also in health. I mean, one of the things that really struck me now is when you look at even COVID-19, the national data on COVID-19 shows that African American deaths are nearly twice as many as the rest of the population at large. And if you go, of course, in particular states and localities, you even see greater disparities. So, and the disparities, again, come from access to healthcare. So you can go all the way down the line in every one of these policy areas and find disparities across racial groups.
Thank you, Esther, so much for explaining those disparities within this policy for us. John, I'd love to hear about the work that Management Leadership for Tomorrow is doing to combat some of this and what you're hearing about the experience of underrepresented minorities through your work.
Right. So I think, first of all, Carmen, thanks for having me. Pleasure to meet you and pleasure to be on this panel with Esther. And I'll first say that, we focus at MLT, we focus on 3 spheres, and you outlined them in your intro, but the first I'll focus on here, which is about economic mobility, okay? And I would argue that, that may be the most important lever as we think about how do we move forward out of some of the real but very unfortunate stats, that dimensionalize the current state as Esther did. And so if you think about, our work is focused on what we call the last mile related to economic mobility, which is folks who overcome the odds that Esther talked about in the K through 12 who get to college, making sure that they're getting the kind of college degree jobs, okay, that deliver economic mobility for their families out of college. And if you know, unfortunately, 60% of Black and Brown four-year recent college graduates are either unemployed or in jobs that don't require a college degree. That's pre-COVID, right? So that last mile is really a tightrope that our folks who've already overcome meaningful odds are fighting to ensure that they're getting the ROI in their college education. And then, and so that helps to explain the very significant wealth gaps that you see between Blacks and whites and Hispanics for those who are college educated and those who are not. It's just like literally, I think it's like Blacks and Latinos have like 25% of the economic wealth that their white peers, and that's comparing college grad to college grad. So there's some very meaningful gaps there that need to be addressed. We're focusing on that last mile, and we're placing about 98% of our students who are largely low, moderate income students in jobs that are averaging 70K plus. So I think we understand how that works, and then we're also obviously focusing on helping those folks once they get into the workforce, giving them the coaching and the high performance playbook to help them to progress toward their and have the kind of career mobility that their white peers are having. The other side of that is really focused on helping institutions create the environment in which that minorities, people of color, have the same opportunities to compete as with their white peers, and there's a lot of work to do on what we call you might say institutional racism side. I kind of call it sort of third-degree racism, but so all these things that speaks to what are the implications for the experience, okay? And to your point, I'd say there are two that I'll mention, and I think and if you put it in the sort of cast this in the world where if you overcome the environment that Esther is talking about, right, and get to places like higher education or into the workforce and in organizations where we perceive there not to be the kind of structural overt racism or policy-driven racism that has that's gone back for decades. These are the places that are now opened, okay, and are viewed as the key parts of our economic mobility system, and so even in one of the challenges is that those are higher education institutions and major employers, they actually think their perception is that the people the folks who are people of color are having a very similar, if not same, experience in college or afterwards in the workforce than their white peers, and that's fundamentally different. And so what is it? What are the differences? Twofold. One is that people of color who are often the first, in their, in their families or in their peer groups to be trailblazing the path that they're on, those folks are dealing with a myriad of distractions that their white peers are not dealing with, that have impact on their ability to make the most out of college, make the most, and be high performers in the workforce. And those distractions include many of the things that Esther said: the economic distractions, the issues that they're dealing with around policing in their home neighborhoods, and dealing with some of the issues that relate to how their white peers perceive them, and in some cases not as high performing, and that gets in your head whether or not it's true. And the second thing I'd say in terms of experience is that because people of color are more often to be first generation college, first generation in the workforce, they don't have, we tend not to have people who have been where we want to go, okay, who know what that bar is for high performance, who have the ability to open doors, and that lack of social capital, okay, that their white peers tend to have much more of, puts us in a position to have to figure things out on our own, right? And that is increasingly difficult, and so the just the day-to-day weight of managing challenges at home and navigating when you're feeling like you're figuring things out on your own, when for some reason your white peers just seem to have, you know, a level of support and things come easier to them, and that ends up actually making you feel like maybe it's me, maybe it's not the circumstances, maybe I'm not as good, and that begins a loop of, it unfortunately leads in some cases to a lower level of confidence in one's own ability. So there are a lot of subtle factors, and I put those in the context of, like, these are in the places where we feel like they're the most open and they're the least structurally racist, right? But yet they're still challenging for people of color who have overcome odds to be in college or be in solid jobs in the workplace.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Don, especially the complexities that come with these disparities within the policy as well. And thank you both for providing some context for within this global pandemic that we're currently in as well. I'd like to shift gears a bit to the history of this economic mobility and urban policy within the US. So for Esther, could you shed some light on the history of structural inequality in education and housing, and how did we get here?
Yeah, you know, I just want to comment for a second on what John is saying, because our two perspectives really connect in a very important way. And so as I provide this historical context and link these outcomes or these inequities to real policy decisions that were made in this country, that's not the end of the story. So I really think that the combination here is an important one for everybody to understand, and the work that John's doing is critical. So even if we change policy, which we're doing now, then it's not the end of what we have to do to deal with inequity and to deal with structural racism, because this has been reinforced over time for a long period of time, making change all the more difficult and making the opportunities less available, frankly. And then even when you get the opportunity, there are so many factors which come in and derail your ability to perform. And particularly when you come from families which have dealt with generations of poverty, as many have done in central cities now. So the history here is really important. And again, it goes to the point of this is something that's developed over time and is entrenched, and I like to say it's not an accident. And the same way, change will not be an accident either. Change will is coming in a very concerted way as a consequence of demand by the public for change. So I don't go all the way back to the founding of the Republic. I'm going to just take a short period of history here that I think is still playing out in some serious ways that people don't necessarily even see or pay attention to. But it really begins with the post-World War II migration out of the South into the North, where Blacks are coming for opportunities, and it starts before World War II, but this is where we see it the most, coming for opportunities primarily in the manufacturing sector, which was concentrated in Northeastern and Midwestern central cities. Everybody knows Chicago, Detroit, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. These are Cleveland. These are the cities which had large percentages of Black migrants coming from the South, and at the same time had jobs available for the Black population in the manufacturing sector. So the big transformation, and we've gone through many economic transformations in this country, right, is this deindustrialization, which was essentially the loss of manufacturing jobs out of central cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And there are obviously simultaneous things going on in southern cities and out in the Southwest, as we call the Sun Belt. But part of what we understand to be structural racism really becomes clear as a consequence of deindustrialization, and also of federal policy post-World War II, which helped white GIs buy homes in the suburbs. So these are some of you may have grandparents or know people who moved out to the suburbs on the GI Bill. These were things that were not made available to African Americans. So much of policy, you can go back to the New Deal even, which was put into place, had carve-outs in order for the Democrats in the Congress from the South to be part of a coalition. There's a great book by Ira Katz-Nelson on this exact subject of what was carved out of the New Deal so that Roosevelt could bring the white Southern Democrats, Southern racist Democrats into his coalition, intentionally carving out African Americans from so many of the New Deal benefits that we take for granted now, whether it was Social Security, particularly, jobs that African Americans found them in didn't have guarantees of minimum wages, of Social Security. This is a pattern over time. And so you look at what happens after deindustrialization, which really starts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you see that middle class, primarily white middle class, but also even the African American middle class, moves out of these central cities, leaving cities with large concentrations of poverty populations, especially African American poverty populations. And this trend to me is so important because people don't get why this is important. And it's important because we have a federalist system, and people are probably paying a lot more attention to federalism now than they ever thought they wanted to, because we see such disparity and differences across states in every way, especially in the political arena now, right? And so the other piece of federalism is that for education, we have essentially, as I mentioned earlier, funding streams that primarily come from an education district. And central cities were underfunded around education, especially as it relates to cities which had high percentages of African Americans. And so there were efforts to deal with this decentralization of school systems to give local control to Black communities. But of course, one of the things that always struck me about this history is by the time African Americans are given political rights and the capacity to have a greater impact on policy, it's a time when there's tremendous economic decline and job loss in these cities, and a loss of revenue to provide better public services. So it's almost like, people said, okay, yeah, this is a great time to elect a Black mayor, but by the way, you're not going to have any money to do anything because your tax base has moved right outside, either to the suburbs or to some rural area in the South, and eventually, of course, as we know, to China, to Asia, and parts of Asia. We can't at the local level capture that revenue. And this is part of what I view to be structural racism. So why is it, education such a great example? Because you can see the disparities in funding. But then there are two important Supreme Court decisions which essentially, kind of stuck the nail in the coffin. We have Brown v. Board of Education, which everybody lauds, that's going to make sure that we can't, we have to desegregate our school systems. But then in 1974, another decision is passed by the courts that people don't realize the same way, Milliken v. Bradley. And what that decision said is that busing children across districts is unconstitutional. So what did that mean? Well, if all the whites left the cities and moved outside those districts, there was no way to integrate school districts. And there's so much research that shows that integrated schools work better for everybody, especially for low-income communities, Black or white. And of course, at the same time, as I said, the funding really dries up, really declines in a significant way because of the loss of the industrial base of cities. So this is really the context for this kind of institutional racism that we were left with in a period in which We have structural barriers. You see this in education. And of course, education is the key to wealth creation, and what John is talking about, and the ability to actually compete. And, you know, a lot of, in the political discourse, people talk about self-sufficiency. You cannot get to self-sufficiency unless you get an education, or you're provided job training or workforce training that actually connects you to a job. When I was in government, the job training didn't connect anybody to jobs. People got paid who did job training, and the metric was, did somebody finish your program, not did they actually get a job. And the population which has been hurt the most by this is the African American and Latino population, who have the worst funded schools and who have, you know, right now disparate outcomes in education. And just, you see the same kinds of things in housing. Home ownership is a source of wealth. It's the greatest source of wealth in this country. It's what makes the middle class. And with most of people's wealth comes from their home, from owning a home. And you find that in the African American community, that there is, at least over the years, 10 to 15 to 20% differences in home ownership between Blacks and whites. And for Latinx, it's even a greater difference. So again, this goes back to things like redlining, which is the difficulty that African Americans had in getting mortgages. So, and the word redline, I don't know if, you know, how many people know this, it actually comes from maps which were redlined by hand to show these are places that insurance companies do not want to insure. These are places where banks do not want to lend money to. They were redlined with red, and they were African American communities that were redlined. And the policies that should have been in place to prevent what was clear discrimination were not enforced, or not, you know, or not at all used to prevent these kinds of activities until much, much later. So you do see change eventually, obviously, in the 1990s and 2000s, but this is deeply embedded and still having an impact.
Thank you so much, Esther, for providing that historical context, as well as the specific details of what we've seen in the past and how that's applied to what we're seeing today. John, could you speak to the direct impacts of these disparities that Esther is describing and the current social climate on the folks that you coach through Management Leadership for Tomorrow?
Yeah, and I want to try to hit it on two levels, if I could. You know, one is the direct implications for for people of color who are trying to be economically mobile, okay, and then direct impact on white people as it relates to how they view people of color. And I think the first point is, what Esther shared. It's so important to understand the history. Right? And if you're a white person, okay, and you're trying to translate what's going on, in our around policing and the unrest we've had in our community with and the disparate impacts of COVID on people of color, and why people of color are underrepresented in our organizations, all this context, you have to understand. You have to understand the history. But I think on top of it, I think that the other challenge for people who for white folks is that even when they do understand the history, for some reason, they don't connect the history to the people of color who are in their world. Okay, so and I think and so you often have to the aha moments don't come until you have actually very recent examples. Whether it's the recent police killings, or it's, I think, that the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park, where you had somebody who is a for all intents and purposes, liberal, highly educated executive who contributed to Barack Obama's campaign. Okay, who believes that that she can get away with calling the police on someone who is bird watching and asking her to obey the law, and thinks that she can get away with ruining somebody's life, right? And so when you see that play out, then it forces you to think about how you view people of color. And I think there are the two things that we focus on, okay? And I'll start by, on the individual level, which is, that what you have to do is prepare and facilitate the navigation in the existing environment. Okay, so people who are, at least in our focus at MLT for students and for young professionals and mid-career professionals is to provide three really important things that help them maximize their potential and their trajectory and navigate in a world that that is tricky. The first thing is what we call sort of high accountability coaching. It's not mentoring; it's distinct from mentoring. Okay, but it's really the kind of coaching that you get in the sports world, where you are focused on the things that you need to demonstrate to get to the next level. Okay, whatever that is, college to a first job or early career to the next level, and having the kind of coaching that once you understand that bar for high performance, having somebody who is actually there holding you accountable to do the things that close the gap between where you are on the skills, experiences, and relationships that you need to nail to get to that next level, and making sure that you're doing those things, and then coaching you through the things that you're twirling around in your head, the distractions that I talked about earlier, and that make it harder for you to execute those things than your white peers. So the coaching that's built around a high performance playbook that's helps them clarify what that bar is, because if you don't have people who've been there before who are close in relationships with you, you're not going to know what that bar is. So you got to know what the bar is, and you have to know where you are relative to the bar, and then the coaching to get there is really important. And then and that third issue is just surrounding folks with a high performing network of peers and informal mentors that provide them that supportive social capital that more often their white peers have. So those are sort of, we find the kind of the core elements: the coaching, the high performance playbook, and the accelerating relationships that enable folks to make the most out of their talent and navigate successfully in an environment where they have more challenges than their white peers. And we do that at every stage, okay? And that's one of the important things. It's making sure that at the key transition points, whether it's high school, whether it's college to early career to first job, or early career to grad school, or mid-career to advanced career, you got to continue to do those things and put folks in position to really make the most out of their talent in a challenging environment. The second thing is working on the institutional side, right? And it's really important for organizations and their leaders to understand that the experience of diverse talent, okay, whether that's a college student, whether that's even a high school student, whether that's a young professional in your organization, the experience that a Black or brown person will have is not the same, okay, than their white peers, even if they have a similar socioeconomic background. Race alone, for the reasons that Esther talked about, it creates a number of different dynamics. The way I like to capture it is, that in the workplace, a person of color will spend literally a third, and this is true even in college, will spend a third of their mental energy every day twirling around questions in their head. How do people view me? Do they view me as capable as they are? Why are there so few minorities around in this organization or in this school? Do I measure up? When you're focusing on those questions in your mind, when you're distracted by them, whether or not there's any validity to those questions, you're still spending spending your mental bandwidth on that, and your white peers are spending 0 minutes of no days of no meetings, no time ever focusing on those issues. So you're at a significant disadvantage. And then same time, beyond the bandwidth constraint and disadvantage, you're also when you're twirling those questions around in your mind, you're going to be less willing, less comfortable taking risk. You're going to be less comfortable bouncing back when you do have setbacks, and it'll take longer to do that. And when people do reach out to you to provide constructive feedback, you don't know whether you're going to be a little bit skeptical as to whether that's coming from a place of lifting you up or bringing you down. So these are the things that that organizations are actually missing. Okay, and so it's really important to work on the organizational side so that that they approach things that fall in the category of how do we recruit and advance more diverse talent. It's really important for them to understand what the experience is of diverse talent. Most of them miss it. Okay, and when you miss it, when you misdiagnose the underlying challenges, then when you're trying to decide, think about where do we go, how do we get to a better place in terms of broader representation of people of color in a more inclusive environment, and you start to think about how to, to define what success will look like in a few years, just like you do in every other part of your business, then you also find that setting goals and objectives and defining success when it comes to race and gender are kind of they're conversations that are that are uncomfortable to have, and because we don't do that, then our strategies to move the needle are not very rigorous, and then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So institutions need to actually understand what how the minority experience is different, and then you need to actually do a few things different related to how you approach talent acquisition and talent advancement. And if you don't work on those levels as well, then it's really hard for the folks who are in those pathways to succeed.
Absolutely. That's amazing work that's happening at MLT. Thank you for explaining that, as well as the experiences that people of color are having both in college and in the workplace. Going right off of that, actually, when it comes to diverse talent in the workplace and advancing that, there's this idea or this concept being thrown around that we've heard called pipeline issue when it comes to recruiting and finding this diverse talent. What could you explain what that is, and is it accurate? And if it's not that, then how are companies failing to enhance the diversity in their companies?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand the question. Is it not a pipeline issue? Is that what you're saying?
Right. Is that a pipeline issue? We've heard some people saying that. If you could explain what that means.
Right. So I mean, this is I've tried to talk about this a lot, and this is one of the examples when I say that that organizations and individuals are not understanding the sort of the root causes and diagnosing the minority experience. The other side of that is they're not diagnosing the pipeline, and we often hear them say, well, there are not enough qualified minorities, or the pipeline is small, and that's but you never hear them. You never hear people who say that. You never hear them actually give you stats about the pipeline when they say those things. And then let me give you a few examples, right? There are 450,000, Black and brown four-year college graduates every year. Okay, 450,000 a year, right? That's not a small pipeline, right? And that's grown meaningfully despite some of the challenges that that Esther talked about in K-12 and so forth. We've got a robust pipeline. But let me go back to what you often hear in the technology sector, right? We don't, and you even hear tech companies saying, we need to go back to improve K-12 STEM education, and before we improve the way teachers teach math and science in high school, then we can't be held accountable for increasing diversity in our organizations, which is completely false. Because if you think about it, I talked about 450 Black and Hispanic four-year college graduates every year. 60% of those folks are not getting college degree jobs. So there's a bigger pipeline. But the issue is, if you think about STEM, there are 50. If you go look at the National Science Foundation data, if you look at on an annual basis the number of, if you combine computer science degree, folks who are majors, computer science majors, math majors, and engineering majors, right? There, of all the degrees that are granted in those three areas, Blacks and Hispanics make up 22%. That's a meaningful number. But more importantly, what is that's a meaningful percentage. What's actually the number? It's 50,000 a year. 50,000 computer science, engineering, and math graduates. So how can you tell me, right, that as an organization, if you're a tech company, right, that's hiring hundreds and hundreds of engineers and software developers and so forth, that you can't hire 10 or 15, okay, who are, when there are 50,000 a year graduating, right? And so the pipeline is there, and the issue is essentially it's an information asymmetry, meaning, you know, the folks who are majoring, you know, just as an example, in the world of technical talent and STEM majors, Black and brown students don't have that, you know, very little exposure to the world of, you know, high tech. They don't have the relationships with people who are there. If they're on the East Coast, where you know, then and have to get up to, you know, get out to California or places in Silicon Valley where a lot of that's happening, that's a stretch for them. So and then the other side of it is what they're learning in the classroom in terms of engineering, you know, applied science and computer science. You know, what they're learning in the classroom actually is not the same. You know, it needs to be translated in a way that reflects the hiring bar, what the competencies the higher organizations are looking for. So there's a disconnect between what college is teaching and what hiring organizations are looking for, and there needs to be a translator in between. That's part of the work that we do at MLT, and that's really important. So this is a completely addressable. The pipeline is there, right? And I would encourage folks who are listening to, when you hear that, just ask the person who said that to, you know, double click on that statement and give, you know, and walk us through the pipeline. And if they can do that, I feel a lot better, but I've not seen it done.
Absolutely. Thank you for elaborating on that concept. So we just covered a lot of heavy ground here. I'd love to close out with some thoughts on what we can all do about this. So Esther, I'd love to hear what needs to change in education, anti-poverty, and housing policy in urban communities, and how do we as viewers affect change?
Okay, so let me try and provide some optimism here. And I'll use first the example of the Black Lives Matter protests around the George Floyd murder and how they've been extended. You know, some people like to say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We are in multiple crises right now, if anybody hasn't noticed. We've got an economic crisis, a health crisis, a criminal justice crisis, and all of them are intersecting at the same time. And of course, cities and states have budget crises to add to that. But there's no question that the protests have amplified the problems in the criminal justice system, that the public understands it in a different way than they have in the past. And you see that in the public opinion polls. And this is key. For some policy change, you can do it inside quietly. For big kinds of changes that we're talking about, John and I here, it requires shifts in public attitudes. What he's talking about in business, what I've been talking about on this policy side. And a poll came out, Mammoth University's poll in June came out, and the findings were really striking. 76% of Americans, including 71% of white people, called racism and discrimination a big problem in the United States. Why is this so important? This is a question that pollsters have been asking for decades and decades. This is a 26 percentage point change since 2015. Now, you know, I study this. You don't have to study it to know that's a big change in public opinion. So we need to grab this now and harness this energy where people are seeing it, where people are starting to understand in every walk of life that we need to make serious changes here. And we're seeing some of that change happen. So one venue for change is at the local government level. And we see in New York, a series of police reform packages were passed in the city council. In DC, this, you know, the mantra of defunding police personally doesn't make me excited, because you always need coalitions in politics, and the word defunding has a lot of negative connotation to it. But we all know that it really means change how we allocate money. And that's happening, you know, moving $1 billion out of the police department and identifying where you think that money should go, is extremely important, whether you think it should go to education, to social services, or to job training, or to, dealing with health disparities. That's a significant amount of money at the local level, and this is an important conversation over the budgets. So my second point here, look local, not just national. That's where people can have the greatest impact in their own communities, in their cities, or in their suburban county governments. It's clearly, in some ways, it's easier to do in cities because there's more transparency, to be honest. But if you look local, hey, obviously you can protest, but then you can organize into groups. You can vote. You better vote. Please vote. I mean, this is my appeal, my civic engagement appeal here. I used to teach a course in American parties and elections, and students would go, who cares? What difference does it make? Please, we know what difference it makes now. It makes a huge difference on who leads this country, on who leads your city. It even makes a difference on who you elect to the city council. So this is important. And run for public office. You can do that now. So many cities have campaign finance boards in which there are matching funds, in which the barrier to entry has been reduced. So, and you see it all over now with minorities electing members of Congress, but electing members of the state legislature to better reflect the interests of their communities. There's no question. There's tons of empirical data that show the importance of minority and women representation in state legislatures, in any legislative body, because issues do not get to the agenda unless you create diversity in these legislative bodies. So it's not enough to say, oh, nice white liberal will represent Black interests. It turns out that you need Black people at the table, just like you need women at the table, you need gays at the table, you need white people at the table, you need the diversity at the table so that the issues come to fore. So I think this is, there's so much that can be done now, and I don't want people to feel cynical. This is a moment of change. And my last request to everybody is, within the political arena, I'll leave it to John to talk about other things. Please pay attention to the budget, your local budget, your budget of your city. The budget tells you what the political priorities are. So when the mayor of New York City announced that he was going to defund summer youth employment programs, everybody organized and went nuts, and the money went back in. This is one example of advocacy and organization. So protests are a great catalyst, are important, but then you've got to organize and do the hard work. You've got to lobby, and you've got to be part of a concerted effort. And then you have to vote. I mean, you just have to vote. If that's all you can do, well, that's good. Just make sure your friends vote too, because it really does make a difference.
Thank you, Esther, for providing those glimmers of hope as well as action items for us to take away. Similar question for you, John, in terms of what we can do, whether it's in the workplace or anywhere else that you're thinking.
Right. I think the way I think about this, I mean, that we've got to address the underlying socioeconomic inequities that I believe are critical to marginalizing racism in this country. And if you think about the analogy of a tree, okay, with a tree of what you see above ground and the roots below. What you're seeing we're all experiencing. We're seeing it in our country right now. A tree on fire, right? We got the issues, the challenges related to policing, the unrest in our communities. We have COVID. We have massive unemployment, and that's the kind of the tree on fire. But the underlying and the root cause disparities are things persistent disparities in economic mobility, wealth gaps, education, social capital, healthcare systems. We got to address those underlying inequities. And my thesis on this is that the path forward to a healthy set of roots and a healthy tree above ground is twofold. I mean, the things that we need to focus on. Number one is we've got to increase in communities of color. We've got to increase economic mobility. We've got to address wealth gaps. Okay, and you have to put more economic power and influence in the hands of people of color. Okay, you have to widen the road, and at the same time, you have to work on the structural side, meaning you have to decrease institutional racism. Okay, actually elevate the cost of institutionally racist behavior. You have to institutionalize and standardize racially equitable employer practices. And once you do those things, okay, then you start then you begin a loop that actually changes the game. So you address increasing economic influence and power and mobility among people of communities of color, decreasing institutional racism. That leads to that addresses the root causes that are inequities that we're struggling with today that got us here. And when you have more people of color who are economically mobile, when you have more people who are people of color in leadership positions, when white people are working in organizations that are more diverse, right? Then that changes white people's narratives about Black people. Okay, and when you change those narratives, that's when police officers start realizing that they can't get away with they're not even going to start they won't try the things that they're doing right now. That's when the Amy Coopers of the world aren't feeling like they're in position to ruin somebody's life. So that change, so when you have to address the persistent inequities, that changes the narrative around race, and that leads to a healthier America that's more consistent with the American dream that we're all focused on. And that is the way to marginalize racism. Okay, that's my theory of the case. When you get down to the brass tacks around what organizations need to do, it's not rocket science. It's organizations need to approach how they become more diverse and how they unwind the practices that historically have disadvantaged people of color relative to competing with their white peers. What you have to do is just take the same, apply in your the same level of rigor to your strategies and tactics around diversity and inclusion as you apply in every other part of your organization. And that's not happening right now. Okay, and the level of rigor isn't there. Organizations aren't setting goals. They're not having a thoughtful organizational approach. And their approach to making their organizations more diverse is actually what is creates what I would say is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meaning, when your approach to diversity compromises excellence, right? Then you won't make progress, and that reinforces in the minds of white leadership that it can't work. Right, and that becomes an excuse. So if you take a rigorous approach and you hold folks accountable, then that's actually how you make progress in this, just like you do in every other part of your business. And so what we've got to do is make sure that organizations are executing rigorous strategies and tactics to unwind the institutionally racist behavior that's happened in the past. That in most cases is not malicious. It's just kind of shrouded in this idea of meritocracy. And they're just not, and they're missing the underpinnings of the diverse, the experience of diverse talent. And then at the same time, you just have to provide folks of color who are in these organizations and who are in colleges. You have to provide them the coaching and help them understand the bar, and you have to surround them with the social capital so they can navigate successfully, in the current environment until we actually unwind the kinds of institutional practices that are holding folks back.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining this, John. I'm going to take the last few minutes we've got here to ask a couple questions from the audience. So Pierre has asked, for John, can you tell us what you consider to be racially equitable employment practices?
Yeah. So those are, I'll call, sort of 4 or 5-fold, which I'll talk to. So the first one is a racially equitable employer practice is one that focuses on moving the needle on representation of Black and Latinx employees, okay, at every level of the organization, okay? And so, what is your plan and how are you executing against becoming more diverse, not just at the lower levels, but at the senior levels on down? Secondly, is what are you doing to create an inclusive anti-racist workplace? Third is, what are you doing to make sure that there's pay equity, compensation equity between white folks and people of color? The fourth one is, what are your, do you have racially equitable business practices relative to not just your suppliers, okay? And are you, when I say suppliers, I'm not necessarily talking just about who has the contracts for your food service. I'm also talking about who are your law firms and who are your investment banks, okay? Who are your professional services suppliers, but also are your products and services and distribution, are you making sure your products, and if you're a grocery store or chain, do you have stores in primarily minority communities, okay? Or are you creating environments that are, food deserts for people of color, right? If you are Airbnb, is your product designed to allow white people to decide to see whether someone who wants to rent your place is Black and allow you to discriminate against them? Or is your product stopping them from seeing what the color is of the person on the other side? So racially equitable business practices, and then the last piece is, what are you doing as it relates to how you're investing in communities of color and how you're advocating for social justice and racial justice in the communities that you work. Those are the 5 areas that we are working to hold organizations accountable related to racially equitable employer practices.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking that down so well for us, John. And one last question for Esther here. Melinda asked, how do we stop companies from profiting from bail in prisons?
That's pretty easy. You do not allow privatization of prisons. First of all, I think one of the most egregious things we've done from a public policy point of view in this country is to create private prisons. The idea that anybody should make a profit from the prison system is outrageous, because if you make a profit, you have to pull money out, and of course that's going to provide less services. And in terms of bail, we're actually in New York, at least right now, we've done huge reform of our bail system so that money bail is not required for any non-violent offense right now, for any non-violent offense. So the bail system, as it's structured right now, of course, is really, if you don't have the money, whether or not you're a flight risk, whether or not you're actually a risk to the community is irrelevant. You end up staying in jail. So this is part of advocacy work that has to be done in every jurisdiction, because bail policy is either generally set by a county or a state government. States can always override cities and counties. So it has to be done, each of these jurisdictions separately. It will be unlikely that we'll get any national policy around bail reform, but this is an example where local activism has made a real difference in many places across the country already.
Absolutely. Thank you for touching on this in our last moments, both of you. Actually, thank you all for joining us as well this evening. Thank you both to Esther and John for their time and energy and sharing their expertise with us. Please be sure to join us for our next month's event discussing bold allyship. Stay tuned for that on the Meetup Live group page. You'll also be able to view this and share recording and recap for this event on our Community Matters blog at meetup.com/blog. Thank you all again so much, and have a great evening.
You too. Nice to meet you, John.